I'm really pleased to have Rob Metcalfe with me today. I've known Rob for a very long time. He has stories that we won't ask him to share, which I would definitely rather that he didn't share, but back in the day. I'll ask Rob to introduce himself, but essentially what we're here to talk about today is employee ownership trusts. Absolutely of the moment topic, which a lot of people are asking me about, and well, go to the main man was my thought on the matter. So Rob, first of all, could you just give us a little bit of background and also tell us how you ended up talking to me, with me positioning you as an expert in EOTs?
Yeah, sure. I started working life as a journalist, and this is quite a long while ago, and it wasn't uncommon then for journalists to make a career move into public relations, and that's what I did after about 10 years of journalism. I joined a PR agency and worked there for 7 or 8 years, and I went to Saatchi & Saatchi and became MD of their UK PR agency, and then European MD of their integrated setup across Europe, which was just a nightmare. I left that, set up my own agency, did that for 5 or 6 years, and then went to Richmond Towers, which is the UK's longest established PR agency, as part of a management buyout team, and was there, in fact, still there in a chairman role, still there in a chairman role, but completed a sale there, an employee ownership sale, in October last year. Parallel with that, for the last 11 years or so, I've been initially an investor and a director of a business called Green Rewards, which is an environment and well-being incentives business, principally for employees. And that completed an employee ownership trust sale in March of this year. So I'm in the unusual position of having been through 2 of these types of transaction very recently. And funnily enough, they were both quite different, and that I'm sure we'll come on to talk about this, but that demonstrates that the way that these things are structured is actually very flexible, and you can, to a certain extent, build the transaction around what you want to achieve. So I didn't know anything about this at all until I was quite a long way into the sale process, of what I thought was the sale process of Richmond Towers. But finding out about employee ownership kind of turned all that on its head, really.
So I suppose it's a reasonable question to ask, in its broader sense, what is employee ownership trust, and how does it work?
Yeah, it's a relatively recent thing. 2014, the legislation came in, and it built on something called the Employee Benefit Trust, which has been around forever. But it did it in a much more tax-efficient way for the vendor, and indeed for the employees who are going to own the business in the future. So essentially, it is setting up a trust that holds the whole shareholding, if it's a 100% transaction, or a majority shareholding, on behalf of the employees. So employees have no shareholding of their own, but they are all members or beneficiaries of a trust that owns the business on their behalf.
Brilliant. So we're billing this as what the M&A firms don't want you to know, and I think there's a lot more we're going to cover on that specifically. But in principle, what are the advantages of an EOT compared to a conventional trade sale or similar?
There's a very big headline advantage, and then there are quite a few other advantages that actually may be more important in the long term. But the headline advantage for the vendor is that you pay no tax on the transaction. There's no capital gains tax. When we're not even in entrepreneur relief territory here, the tax on the transaction is 0. So that can make it seem superficially very attractive, and indeed it is. It's a really nice incentive to do this thing. But I'm very much of the view that should not be the sole motivation for going through with an EOT transaction. The other benefits, there are ongoing benefits for the employees that own the business, in that they can receive a distribution every year, tax-free, up to £3,600 each. So there's a really nice kind of tangible benefit for the employees. But as a vendor, I think the real benefit is that, as I said a moment ago, you can shape the transaction to a certain extent to how you want it to be. You can plan your own exit in the way that you want. And you can stay as involved with the business as you wish or not. And certainly when I was looking at a trade sale, the idea of an earn-out period and working for somebody else under those circumstances and so on, really, you know, I would have accepted it, but it didn't appeal greatly. So the ability to build a structure that worked for me, but also worked for the business and for the rest of the people within the business, you know, I thought was a really attractive thing.
And on the face of it, it might sound like it's similar to a management buyout or a sale to a staff team. What's the distinction between those two?
It is a slightly different thing in that it's supposed to be permanent. It's meant to be a shift of the ownership of the business away from individuals into collective ownership for the long term at least, even if not permanently. And the way that the tax incentives are structured are to try and ensure that it's done in that way. I think what it requires is a slightly different way of looking at a business going forward. And the Richmond Towers business has been around since 1930. So it's quite easy in those circumstances, even though I was the 80-something% majority shareholder, really to think of my time in that business almost as a custodian. Because you know it had been around for a long while before me, and I'm hoping it will continue a long while after me. And actually, in that kind of role, being able to pass it on to the next generation in a way that preserves it, not in aspic, but keeps the best of the business going forward, and gives it a fair chance to remain independent and thrive with the people that are currently within it, and so on and so on, I think was a really nice way of doing it. In the Green Rewards case, I mean, that's a relatively new business, 10 or 11 years. That was much more about really giving a relatively small team, 10, 11 employees, the chance to seize this thing and really run with it and build it into something really, really big in the future. So, yeah, I think the kind of starting point for thinking about whether it's a good thing is really around what you want the business to be in the future. And you may say, well, look, I'll be gone, so I don't really care. But actually, if you do care about the business, and if that is the case, then this probably isn't the right transaction for you. But if you do care about the business and you are invested in it emotionally as well as financially, and you want it to, legacy is a ridiculous word to use in these circumstances, but if you want it to continue in the way that you've spent, you know, a good chunk of your life directing and building it and strengthening it and motivating the people within it to deliver and so on, then actually this is a really nice way of at least giving that a chance.
Thank you. And I was connected, or someone tried to connect with me this morning on LinkedIn, and we'd had an exchange on a discussion, and they said basically all agency sales are about getting as much money out as quickly as you can, and then legging it before everyone realizes they've been mugged. And I've experienced an awful lot of those on, you know, been involved in both ends of that, unfortunately. But sometimes I think EOT is seen as a slightly worthy, slightly, you know, you mentioned the word legacy and then you sort of backtracked a little bit, because it can be seen as a slightly worthy, this is my legacy for the world. It isn't that though, is it at all? It's just an alternative mechanism that is maybe driven by different motivators. Yeah,
it is. I mean, it's a, you know, if you look at shared ownership as a socially progressive thing, then it is that, and it is worthy to that extent. But it's not a charitable act. You know, the vendors should receive full market value for their shares, so they're not giving anything away. Now, okay, you can talk about the difference between that full market value and the value that they might get in a contested trade sale or competitive trade sale. But yeah, if you're getting the proper market value for your shareholding, then it's actually a very sound financial move to make. It's a really good way of realizing the value in a business. But it's kind of turning that flog it and run mentality on its head in a way. And yeah, I was
going to say that. I think one of the real benefits, it seems to me, of EOT is that you can continue to have an involvement in the business and contribute to the success of that, or the continuation of that story, but whilst realizing some of the value that you built up in that business over time.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, that depends on the new owners of the business, or your colleagues, actually wanting you to stay in that role. I don't think you can force yourself into that role. But yeah, and you can, to a certain extent, because you're in control of the sale process as the vendor, you're sort of sitting on both sides of the fence to a certain extent. You can kind of map, what that involvement might be, and how you might be, not leading the company anymore necessarily, but certainly helping it to thrive into the future.
And there are choices around the amount of equity that you release and when you release that as well, aren't there? As there are in all trade sales, theoretically.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, the transaction has to be for over 50% of the shareholding. Over 50% has to go into the trust, and it has to stay in the trust as well in the future. So you can't reduce the trust shareholding below 50%. But you can do anything from 50% up to 100%, and you can only do one deal. So you sell what you sell on transaction day, but you can structure the payment for that over a period of time.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So it sounds great, and if you've got the right motivations and the right kind of business, it's definitely an option. But what are the obvious? Well, what are the sort of the largest and most immediate limitations of an EOT? Do you think?
So you need the right people in the business for a start. So in the same way, I guess, that you would actually give quite a lot of attention to succession. I mean, particularly in a management buyout situation, but probably also in a trade sale, because you're looking to your next generation of management to be attractive to a purchaser. Mm. In this instance, you need to think, I think, even more widely about who are the team that are actually going to get this and run with it and make the most of it. So I think you need to be very sure that you have the type of business that can thrive under this type of arrangement, because it is a different form of management. It is very inclusive. I mean, you could run it dictatorially, but it would be right against the spirit of what an employee ownership trust is. So there's a great deal of engagement with the owners on all levels, and it's a very, certainly in the two examples that I've been involved with, it becomes a very open and collaborative way of running a business. That doesn't mean that you can't manage it. You can still manage it, and decisions still have to be made and so on, but they're done in a slightly different way, I think, than conventionally. So you have to be kind of reasonably confident that can work. And if you're in an agency, a services type business, an architect's practice, those sorts of things, those sorts of businesses where you're collaborating on a daily basis to get tasks done with your colleagues, and there's a collegiate feel about the way that business runs anyway, it's actually a very natural step into this type of management structure. So you need to be sure that that's going to work for you, or reasonably confident that it's going to work for you. Apart from that, well, there are a number of risks that become evident as you think about how this is going to work. Not least how and when you get paid. You do the transaction on day one, but actually in both of my instances, it's a 5-year payout period. So you have to be reasonably confident, and COVID is a nice kind of bracing wake-up call on this front. You have to be reasonably confident the business is going to be able to pay you out, whether it's within the specified time or have extensions in place or whatever, that the business is actually going to thrive and be able to do that. So if you were doing a trade sale, you could be 100% confident of the money that you're getting on day one, and then you're taking the same kind of gamble to a certain extent on getting the rest of what you'll do. And we've all seen trade sales where the purchaser has gone bust shortly after a transaction. So in that sense, there's probably no more or less security. In fact, as an owner selling to an employee ownership trust, you know what the state of the business is like and what its finances are like. And probably
you can't really hide things, can you, from yourself?
You can't hide things from yourself under those circumstances. So maybe that isn't such a worry after all. So it's really about cultural fit, and the tax-free element of it looks really attractive, but actually, if you're doing it only for that, it's probably not the right.
I do wonder if there are a number of agency owners who we could probably all name these types, but where they have driven the growth of the business through their own will and personality. They are the cult within the agency, probably the name over the door, and probably would struggle to see a world where that agency continued without their presence. And maybe those are the people who are looking at this and going, what is this kind of neo-socialist democratized process, because they've never maybe run their business that way.
No, absolutely. And again, we probably both know quite a lot of people just like that. And that's not to say they're not successful and running fabulous businesses, but it is all about them, or largely about them. And that probably is, it wouldn't be impossible to build an employee ownership structure out of that, but it would require quite a lot of effort around, shifting the business from that very centralized kind of approach with a dominant individual into something that is kind of broader friendly.
And just to backtrack very slightly, the point you made about the 5-year earnout that you have, that isn't a requirement of EOT. That's a requirement of the agreement you came to with your businesses. And conceivably, you don't have to be in the business at all.
Oh no,
you can step away completely. It's not like an earnout where you have to be, suddenly reporting to somebody else's group chief exec for 3 years. I mean, that is just because that's the way you've chosen to structure it, so that you have why have you gone for that sort of structure rather than just stepping away and disappearing onto the East Coast?
It is one of the attractions of it is that there is a great deal of flexibility about what you do after the sale. And yes, you can sell the business and walk away from it, but actually that seems slightly contrary to why you're doing this anyway. Actually, you're doing this transaction because you want this business to thrive into the future and stuff. And actually, you have a vested interest in it doing that, because you have some cash locked up in it that you need to get your hands on in due course. So there are good reasons to stay engaged, but the payback period can be 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, whatever you think is most comfortable for the business to achieve. You can fund it with various different sources, and perhaps we'll come on to that in a moment. Yes, you can be quite flexible about what you do and how you do it. So, for example, in my instance with Richmond Towers, I now do 2 days a week in a chairman role for the first year after the transaction, and that expires in October. And when we get to October, I'll sit down with the senior management team and they'll say, "Bugger off, Rob, we don't want ever to see you again." Or they might say, "Carry on doing this," or
they've been saying that 3 days a week, Rob, but you haven't been in the office. That's
absolutely. So I think you get into the situation where you can have those discussions. You can build in protections for yourself as well as the vendor, so you can have veto over the particular areas of decision making until payout is complete. So there are those sorts of things in there. So you don't have to lose complete control of this venture. But yeah, you do not have to stay working for somebody else within the business in perpetuity. You can ease yourself out of it. So for somebody who is looking at a sale that is leading into retirement, or partial retirement, or a change of pace, or a slightly different mix of portfolio roles, or whatever it is, then this can work very well as a kind of transition into that.
Brilliant. And I suppose this idea of not relinquishing all control is one of the really appealing aspects of this, isn't it? That you can define that up front. You don't just have to kind of hand it over and hope. You really do have the ability, and it's quite substantial control you can write into this if you want to, isn't it?
Yes, it is. Yeah, the trust deed is basically your Bible for the way that the business operates going forward, and there is a huge amount of flexibility in how you structure the deed and what goes into it and so on. So I think there are sort of four parties involved in the decision-making part of the business. You have the former owners, the vendors or vendor. You have the trustees. In one of our instances, it's an individual trustee, corporate trustee. In the other instance, it's a trustee company with its own board, but there is a trustee element. You have the management team, and you have the employees, the owners. And to a greater or lesser extent, all of those parties have a role in agreeing what the company does. For very, very big decisions, then the vendor needs to be involved. But for day-to-day running, obviously not. But yeah, you can be very flexible at how you structure that.
It feels like there's this really healthy creative tension between those different parties that creates quite a bit of rigor in the decision making, depending on the level of that decision making, which could actually be highly beneficial to a business, particularly if it's still in growth phase.
Yeah, it should be. Yeah, really beneficial. It does require a little bit of a mind shift on behalf of the previous management or current. It does require a little bit of a mind shift on behalf of the management team, but probably not too much, because really, if they're doing what they should be doing, they should be engaging with everybody anyway. It's just that the engagement might become a little bit more structured and formal and organised. So, for example, we have at Richmond Towers, we have a management team of 8 people, and we have a board meeting, a management team meeting every month, but we also have an owners meeting every month where everybody in the business gets to hear about the numbers, what we're thinking we're doing, what the management team is doing. They can ask questions about any aspect of the business at all, and so on and so on. So, an owner member comes to the management team meetings as well. So there's a great deal of interaction and so on, and sharing of information right around the business. And it does mean, I think, that everyone becomes much more engaged in what the business is doing. And the corollary of that is that they become much more engaged in the success and the profitability of the business as well, because they hear about it, and how we do as a business suddenly becomes much more relevant to them as a partial owner. The research that's been done in this sector suggests that employee-owned businesses are more profitable and more productive than non-employee-owned businesses. So there are some tangible benefits on a business level that come out of this sort of structure.
Why would the M&A firms whose mission is to help owners realize value from their businesses as effectively and with as little risk as they can, why wouldn't they be more enthusiastic about EOTs?
I think there are a number of reasons. I think there are still a lot of M&A advisors that don't know what it is, that think that EOT is the same as EBT, that employee ownership trust is another version of an employee benefit trust, and they are quite different both in structure and operation. I think a lot of M&A advisors are wedded to the battle of a trade sale, and they have a methodology which involves recruiting interested parties and setting them against one another to get the highest price for a deal, and that is the way that they work. I also think that possibly there aren't the rewards in it for them, because it's a very simple transaction. It's not adversarial because you really don't have another party that you're fighting against in legal terms. So the legals are relatively cheap. The financing is relatively cheap. So the need for expensive advice, I mean, obviously you do need advice, you need professional advice, but the need for M&A type of advice isn't really that great. So a pure play M&A advisor isn't going to get a great deal out of an EOT transaction.
I mean, I recall many transactions where the due diligence is where the kind of heavy lifting is done, and that's how we might justify our existence, that, you know, we will uncover everything and make sure everything is ready. And you know, dozens and dozens of junior analysts dribbling away, producing packs and data and information, all of which is removed in this circumstance.
Yeah, it is. I mean, obviously, you know, you give undertakings that the business is in the condition that you say it's in, and so on. But that is all there, you know, to be seen openly by all parties. So, yeah, there are no warranties. You know, none of that is needed.
Of course, but you do need professional advice in this, don't you? You do need. It is. I can't remember if you told me this or if somebody else did, but there are people who will say they know about EOT. There are legal firms, and you know, you do need. Well, perhaps tell us the sort of professional advice that's really worth getting in these circumstances, and maybe just a couple of things to look out for there, because I think there's some people are starting to get that EOT is a good thing and it's not going to go away, and maybe your EOT is the one they'll base their reputation on going forward. So what advice do you need with this?
I mean, you need financial advice and you need legal advice, but actually it's quite unlikely that your current accountant will know what an EOT is and how to help you set one up. It's quite unlikely that your current lawyer will either. There are only 470 employee-owned businesses in the UK at the moment, so the chances of your current advisors having worked relatively recently on something like this is fairly slim. You need to be sure that they know what they're talking about, and that they know what an EOT is versus an EBT, because again, they might start taking you down that route. So you do need those pieces of advice. There are specialists out there, but I think it helps to get breadth of advice as well, if you can, because the specialists that I've spoken to in the EOT space have a very prescriptive way of putting an EOT transaction together. Maybe it works for them as a way of delivering advice. You know, you do it this way, you structure it this way, your trust must be made up in this way, and here's the documentation, and off you go. Which works for a lot of people, but I think potentially you lose out on a lot of the benefits, which are around the flexibility that this deal offers you in the way that you run the business and so on in future. So I would certainly look for the right lawyers and look for the right accountants. Again, neither of those should be hugely expensive because it's not a difficult transaction in that sense. The Employee Ownership Association, the EOA, is a really, really good source of information, and it supports a really strong community of businesses that have done this. And if you go to the EOA conference, it's kind of like an evangelical movement almost. People are so enthusiastic about this form of transaction and having done it, and they want to tell you how it's transformed their business and what it's done for them. So there is no shortage of that kind of advice out there. But what I would have benefited from, I think, would be somebody who'd been through it, who could hold my hand to a certain extent. Not a lawyer, not an accountant, but somebody who could say, well, have you thought about this? And actually, you know, you don't have to have your trust here. You could have your trust in Guernsey, and this is what it means in terms of future implications. And I haven't yet come across an advisor a professional advisor who is kind of delivering the whole breadth of the EOT story.
My gut feel, having spoken to you at length about your transactions and other people who've gone through the process, is that your point about having more breadth is a good one. I think because of the complexity in these deals is in producing a deal that suits all parties, rather than the relatively simple deal of an M&A deal, which is how quickly can I get my cash and how quickly can I get out. That breadth of advice from a tax point of view and from a legal point of view seems to be important. So looking for an advisor with experience of EOT, but without a cookie cutter model that they're just going to kind of hammer out and that you fit within. There's a danger you could end up just fitting into their model and somewhat naively just being led through because you're told that's the process, that becomes your process too, and therefore reinforces the fact that that's the process.
Yeah, that's a real danger.
How do you avoid that?
Well, that is a real danger, and you know, I would say talk to people who have done it, but talk to people who have done it in different ways if you can. I mean, just a thought, you know, the EOT structure is meant to be permanent or long term at least, and the tax structure within it is designed to do that. But we know that agency type businesses may yet be, you know, even an employee-owned ownership agency business may yet be sold. You know, it could be subject of a trade sale in 5, 10, 15, 20 years' time. The EOT as such doesn't preclude that. It doesn't make it necessarily less attractive to a purchaser. So there's that possibility in the future. So where you have your trust now, be it in the UK or offshore, is really important about how that deal is going to be taxed in 15 or 20 years' time. Now, it depends on your advisor, but you know, I suspect that I know a number of advisors are saying you must have your trust based in the UK because that's the way it should be, and that steers you down a certain path. And if you're not even thinking about, well, could I have it over here, and what are the implications of that, and what does this mean in terms of capital gains tax in 15 years' time for the remaining employees in the business, etc., then you're narrowing down the opportunities. And as I said right at the beginning, the flexibility of this thing is one of the really exciting elements of it. You know, you can structure the trust and the way that the business is run to deliver what you think are benefits both for yourself, for your management team, and for the owners into the long term.
That's what's really struck me about this again and again, is the difference in the deals that have been done based around the motivations of the vendor and of the team that are taking it on in the business, and the sort of the collaborative discussion and negotiation between them to come to an agreement which suits all parties. And I think the old model said, you know, you realize some value and just stay in and keep running the business, or you sell it, or you just suck it up and carry on until you can find a buyer. This just seems a fantastically flexible opportunity for someone who might not want to entirely remove themselves from the industry, but does want to do other things. Yeah,
it is exactly that. I think it requires your senior management team to be willing to take part in this thing, and it may be that they harboured ambitions of becoming sole owners themselves or joint owners or whatever it might be. So you need to deal with the aspirations that they might have had there. And again, you can build incentives and rewards into the structure. You can build partial share ownership into the structure going forward for individuals. So there are ways of meeting those aspirations, I think, but they are not going to be sole owners of a business going forward. They're going to be part of an ownership team, probably. But within those kind of constraints, there's a huge amount of flexibility. And actually what you see are really strong former family-owned companies taking this probably is a legacy situation, taking the family legacy and the founders or second generation or third generation of the families ways of running a business and personality within the business through into employee ownership. See a fair amount of that. You see a lot on the agency or partnership type structure. Less so, I suppose. I mean, John Lewis is the best known employee ownership type model out there, and that's an older structure. That's not an EOT structure. And there are some very large businesses that have this kind of structure, but it is still relatively new, at least in terms of the EOT setup. And I think there is huge potential for agency type businesses to make it work very successfully.
There's so much to cover, and we can't cover the whole of EOT here. I've got about 24 questions left I want to ask you, but I want to ask you a couple. One is about financing, because it isn't always financed in quite the same way as, well, clearly not as in a trade sale. And the other one is about if you were going through a sale process of some kind that wasn't an EOT, and you watched this and you went, my God, Rob has dropped the scales from my eyes, I'm inspired to think about EOT. Can you pivot at some point, or is this something that really you have to be committed to from the off?
No, starting with that one first. Really, all the disciplines that you're putting in place over whatever it is, 2-year period, 3-year period, leading up to the kind of trade sale route, really are just they're just the same. They're about getting your business in good shape to go forward, and none of that work will be lost. If you say at the 11th hour, actually, an EOT is a better route in terms of the future for this business. I suspect, a lot of people haven't considered it because they don't know that it's there as an option. I didn't know it was there as an option until I saw another agency do it. And at that time, I was way down the route of either a management buyout or a trade sale approach. So it is definitely possible to steer your deal towards an EOT structure.
And that does maybe come from the fact that the conventional M&A firms are not likely to encourage you. If you're happy to go down the route of a conventional sale, then they're unlikely to want to swerve you towards this kind of deal.
I suspect so. I mean, I may be doing them an injustice, but I suspect so, for the various reasons that we've discussed. And again, you shouldn't just be doing this as a tax-saving exercise. You've got to be doing it for the right reasons around the future of the business and the structure.
And then broadly, the funding type options?
Yeah, so the funding kind of falls into three parts, and actually they're the same 3 parts that you would fund a management buyout with or whatever. There will be cash within the business, hopefully. There will be potentially external financing, although we didn't do that in either of our deals. And there will be loans from the vendor to the business that get paid back, or the trust that get paid back over a period. So you've kind of got your 3 parts of the mix that you can weight towards an initial payout if the cash is in the business, or you can raise external loan funding. You can weight it towards the initial payment on day one, and we're doing quarterly payments for 5 years, for example. So, but yeah, as long as you're confident that the business is going to be able to meet those payments out of its trading profits over that period, then it's relatively easy to structure.
I guess given that a lot of agencies have been leaning on their balance sheet quite hard in the last few months, possibly then you're going to have to think really hard and long about how you structure that finance deal, aren't you? You are, because it makes no sense to make it unrealistic from your point of view as the vendor, because you actually do want to get paid the money that you're owed. So putting in a structure that the business can't meet makes no sense at all. So you do have to think about it quite carefully. We looked at external funding, but so there would be a bigger chunk up front and less going forward. But actually, we thought that the cost of that weighed against
the pragmatism of a smaller amount up front and a bigger chunk going forward for the benefit of the business, really. Why pay an external funder significant chunk when actually that could stay in the business and be for the benefit of the business? So there's a fair amount of flexibility there. There are lenders willing to lend into the sector. There are those that do it fairly stringently at fairly high rates. There are also some socially driven lenders as well, who are perhaps a little bit more realistic in terms of what they want.
Okay, so last question then. If you met an agency owner who hadn't thought about EOT, and you had a sort of grabbed a 30-second conversation with them, what would you say to them to help them maybe get to the point where they would consider it?
Okay, so I think I'd say you have spent however many years it is of your life building this thing. There is a way to ensure that it continues in the way that you have made it so successful so far, without handing it over to a third party. That's attractive in itself, but also you can do that in a way that delivers the market value of the business to you. So you get a proper valuation and you will get that money, and you can do it in a way that's incredibly tax efficient, both for you, but also has great tax benefits for all those people who've helped you make this business successful so far, and will help you, will help the business to flourish into the future as well.
Fantastic. So I know you're still working at Richmond Towers, and you have your fingers in various pies. But if people wanted to get hold of you, if they wanted to tap into your experience, which is pretty unique, having actually gone through it twice, as well as I know you've advised some other people on this, would you be happy for people to get in contact in some way?
Oh, I'd love to. Yeah, absolutely. No, I'd be very, very happy to talk to anybody. An initial conversation, and I will ramble on, I'm afraid, possibly at some length for quite some time, but very, very happy to do that. And if anyone wants a hand-holding through the process, or to talk in more detail about the options that are available, or if they want to know who I've come across who I think are the good guys in the sector, then yes, very, very happy.
Great. You've become one of those evangelists, haven't you? It's fantastic to see. We'll share your details somewhere on this video.
Lovely.
Fantastic, Rob. Thank you so much. That was really, really interesting. Appreciate it. Hopefully we'll talk again.
It's a pleasure. Thank you, Andy.
You were.